Hello, and welcome to Funding Private Land Projects. My name is Stacia Stelk, and I am here today with Tim McCoy and Andy Carmack. This is a Zoom session, so don't forget to comment using the chat button and ask questions via the Q&A button at the bottom. At the end, we will take a few minutes to answer some of your questions. Now I'd like to proceed with introductions. Tim McCoy is the District Conservationist for the USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service based in Paola, Kansas. Through NRCS, he provides technical and financial support for farmers and other landowners that wish to adopt conservation practices on their properties. Tim is deeply committed to protecting the environment and being responsible stewards of our resources. His background is in conservation biology and field research in the Adirondacks. Andy Carmack has worked with the Missouri Department of Conservation as a private land conservationist for more than 15 years. He enjoys sharing his knowledge of the outdoors with everyone, and in his time off, he enjoys pursuing all of the wildlife species that Missouri and surrounding states have to offer. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. And Tim, I believe we're going to start with you, and so I'm going to pop off and mute myself, and then we'll transition to Andy's presentation.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, I'm going to kind of start out and just kind of give you guys a nice overview of our programs. Hold on just a second here. Okay. So yeah, as Stacia said, I'm the district conservationist for NRCS and in the Paola, Kansas office. Our office services the Kansas side. We service Miami, Johnson, and Wyandotte counties. So just to kind of lay out what I'm going to present, I'm going to talk about our actual agency, kind of the history and the mission of our agency, our cost share programs, give a couple examples of assistance available, and then just provide some additional resources. So Hugh Hammond Bennett is kind of the godfather of our Soil Conservation Service, or NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, and he was the key person that got Congress and the federal government to start this agency in wake of the Dust Bowl. So it was created in 1935 in response to the Dust Bowl, and as I said, yeah, it began as the Soil Conservation Service, and through our agency, we provide free technical and financial assistance to farmers and ranchers. And I've got forest managers, but also, a lot of landowners that do any kind of farming, growing. They have just conservation ideas. There's a lot of folks that we work with. And we have not just one or two practices. We probably got about 80 practices that we can help cost share on, depending on the goals, but also the resource concerns that we're trying to solve. I do have to stick our mission statement in here as well as our vision, and I won't read that to you guys, but you can it gives you a nice idea, again, like what are we doing out on the landscape, and what is our purpose as public servants.
Hey, Tim, are you clicking through a slideshow? Because if you are, I'm not getting it.
Uh-oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm so sorry about that, you guys. Hang on just a second. Might help if I shared my screen.
Andy, thanks for saying something. Yes,
Thank you, Andy.
Wait, did I miss something too? Teamwork.
All right. Can you guys see that now?
Yes, but you might. There we go. Perfect. Is
that better?
Excellent.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. Sorry about that. We'll start I'll just kind of click through these. Again, just giving you an overview, history and mission of the agency, and just kind of what we're going to talk about. So that's Hugh Hammond Bennett. That's one of his famous quotes. And again, he's a very interesting character in United States history. And the other cool thing about our agency is we're one of the last agencies to survive the New Deal, because we came about during that era after the Dust Bowl. But again, we are here still, and now exists as the Natural Resource Conservation Service. There's our mission statement. which is we deliver conservation solutions so agricultural producers can protect natural resources and feed a growing world. Caveat that usually changes every couple of years, but it's all kind of that same idea. It used to be we help people help the land. We still do that, but it just, they change it from time to time. So some of the things, when you have farming, anytime you're doing any kind of work out on the land, growing food, any number of things, anybody that's done anything in that regard, that there are caveats and problems, and a lot of times this can become very large problems, as in the Dust Bowl. But even now, we've got quite a few issues, especially with water quality, nutrients, runoff, sedimentation, you name it. And so there's a lot of opportunities to use our natural resources, but then there's ways that can be done where it really negatively impacts the whole public at large and the environment. And so we are trying to mitigate that. We want people to still be able to farm and make a living and do what they do, but also preserve the resources that all of us enjoy. And so there's just a few pictures on the left. Two of them are from me in my journeys, and one's on the top, and then obviously the one in the bottom is an old picture from Oklahoma during the Dust Bowl. But this stuff still goes on. That one that's in the middle, that's from Wyandotte County. The one on the left is from Johnson County. And so you have, these are very recent issues. Obviously the scale is different than in the Dust Bowl, but we're still talking about a lot of soil loss, erosion, sediment, nutrients leaving the landscape, and up in the right corner, you see that beach closed sign. So I started out my career with NRCS up in Burlington, Vermont. And Vermont is, people think of it as a very clean and beautiful state, and it is. However, all of the waterways on the west side of the state run into Lake Champlain, and Lake Champlain divides New York and Vermont. And so what we would have is anytime you would have a widespread spreading of manure across the state, because there's a lot of dairy farms, you could potentially get these algae blooms in the lake. And whenever they close the beaches, you would hear about it, because the whole public is using that lake. That lake is a precious resource up there. And so you really got to see the impacts of doing stuff. Obviously, there's other factors like septic systems and whatnot, but farming was a large part of that. And so in Vermont, we were working on trying to solve that problem. And we're doing the same thing here. It's just that it's not as visual. We don't have these lakes where all the water feeds to. A lot of our stuff goes down, ends up in Mississippi, and then in the Gulf down in Louisiana, where we have a huge dead zone, again, from all these nutrients and runoff. So that kind of gives you an idea of some of the stuff that we do, but let's talk about our agency itself. So NRCS cost share programs. So the way that we help farmers and producers, we provide both technical and financial support. The technical support, anybody can call the office or email me or come by, and we can talk about your problems. And oftentimes myself or some of my staff are going to go out to the field and take a look. We want to see what's going on the landscape and what opportunities or what we can do, what we can recommend to help solve those issues. And then a lot of times that will lead to a cost share application. We have several cost share programs where we provide cost share to fix problems or to install conservation practices. The main one that we use is EQIP. EQIP is the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, and that is the one that has a whole host of practices that we will help cost share on, and we'll kind of get into that right after this slide. That's that but there's all government programs have a lot of acronyms. CSP is another one that we utilize, and CSP is the Conservation Stewardship Program, and that's usually geared towards landowners or producers that are already adopting conservation practices, and they want to go above and beyond that. And so there's additional financial incentive for them to do that. CRP is a Conservation Reserve Program, and that is administered through the Farm Service Agency, but we provide the technical help on that one. RCPP is a Regional Conservation Partnership Program, and that's another program that provides cost share for certain practices, depending on the region and what the focus is. A couple of years ago, I had one contract where we planted, what we helped pay cost share on 12 to 1,500 trees. It just depends on what and where that money's focused, and that does vary from state to state. Some other programs, Conservation Innovation Grant, Wildlife or Wetland Reserve Program, and then CSP-GCI is Conservation Stewardship Program, Grassland Conservation Initiative. And that is where some folks, you get a payment to leave something in grass, and they get a payment each year. So there's several programs that we have, but like I said, the most common one that I utilize is EQIP, and we'll kind of go through. Anytime you work with our agency, there is a process for you to be eligible. It's not a terribly difficult process, but there are some steps that you have to take, and one of those is to get your records established with the Farm Service Agency, and to realize that you're going to have some tax documentation and that sort of thing that comes along with any federal programs, because you wouldn't be receiving a grant if you got funded, or it's treated as a grant, but you don't have to pay it back, but you have to file taxes with showing that you received funds to do certain things. But you can kind of see the steps here, and there is a PDF in the presentation that anybody can pull up that's just the same exact slide. And whenever I work with folks or they inquire about stuff, we kind of talk about this in a lot more detail. But there are a few steps to getting eligible. And then the other piece of that is that all of our programs are voluntary. And so when people come to us, part of the deal is that we are able to go out and access their land and with their permission. But when they sign up for programs, they're saying that I can come to your land and take a look at the issues out there. And we're one of the only federal agencies that are able to access private land. And it's because of that voluntary nature of our programs. So just to give you a couple of examples, we have a lot of people traditionally, and not only in the Dust Bowl, but present day, like to till up their ground after they have gotten the crops off. And when they do that, there's a whole host of issues that can come about because of that, and erosion, sedimentation, nutrient loss, runoff of the soil, gully formation. And so one of the things that we help people adopt and encourage people to do, and give them technical and financial resources, are no-till planters, or not no-till, not the planters, but the planting, like getting them to adopt that technology, and then cover crop. So a system that is going to manage that residue that you can see on the left underneath the example. You've got all those corn stalks and all that stuff, but that's actually really good for the soil. And you can even see underneath that, you've got a cover crop under there. So again, we're feeding the soil. It's a living, system. Another example would be grazing management. We've got a lot of folks that graze their cows, and sometimes that near water. Sorry about that. And that can create a mess, if you can imagine. You've got cows that punch up the banks, they defecate and urinate in the water, they punch up down into the water. And so there's a lot of issues. And sometimes we'll pay for folks to fence their cows out of the water, find a different water resource. And we provide grazing plans. We recommend rotational grazing. So there's a lot of different options, but those are just a couple of examples of some of the services that we provide. The picture on the bottom is something that's in progress. The picture on the top looked like that about a year prior, and then we fenced the cows out of that and made quite a difference on the stream bank. These folks here are actually two farmers, or it's a farmer family that I worked with up in Vermont. And they did a rotational grazing plan where they used temporary fencing and cross fencing, and they rotate their animals quite regularly, and their place was a phenomenal success. And I think they still work with our folks up there in Vermont. But I have definitely have some farmers here in Kansas that are doing the same kind of thing. So here's some resources. USDA.gov and farmers.gov are really good resources just to kind of poke around and see what kind of help is available for folks. But just calling me or talking to somebody in an NRCS office is also hugely helpful. Extension agencies are really helpful. And the other thing I want to point out here is web soil survey. If you guys are not aware of that, that gives you an idea of we can pick any kind of where you're located and find out the soils that are underneath and a lot of information. It's a really nice, easy website to use. And I just want to thank everybody for your time. And there's my information. Feel free to contact me or email me, and I'm happy to assist. One thing I should mention here, in an urban setting, you can see in the right-hand corner, we've got a high tunnel there. That's one of the things that we do help cost share for. And I've gotten folks that have gotten those in backyards all the way out here or down in southern Miami County. So that it just varies. So that's my presentation, and I will stop sharing and answer any questions anybody has.
I'm not seeing any immediate questions in the Q&A section, but I would encourage our guests to start populating that, and we can do Q&A at the end if that's okay with you. Excellent. Okay, Andy.
All right. Very good. Can everyone see that that screen there?
Looks good.
All right. Well, thank you for having me here. My name's Andy Carmack, and I'm what they call a private land conservationist. So my job is to meet with private landowners to advance fish, forest, and wildlife resources on private land. So the majority of Missouri, I know Tim was talking about Kansas a lot, and we're on the line here, but the majority of Missouri is privately owned. So in order to make good conservation advancements on private land, you're going to have programs. And this presentation is not meant to overwhelm people. Tim talked about the acronyms. The federal government programs is a little bit like alphabet soup, right? So you gotta go through all these 3 or 4 letter acronyms, but the take-home message to the presentation is use us. We're a great resource to help you get to where you want to be. So this isn't an all-encompassing presentation. There's 15 slides here. It's just meant to I kind of tried to tailor this particular presentation towards maybe the viewership of the Deep Roots Conference. But there are literally hundreds of practices that are available. And most of the time we can help you reach your land management goals on your farm. So I'm going to go into just a little bit more depth about what the Missouri Department of Conservation has for cost share programs. And then I'm going to kind of give a little bit of overview on some EQIP and CSP, as well as the CRP that Tim was talking about. So Oh. Okay, so the department has what they call a LCAP, which stands for, here we go with the alphabet soup, right? The Landowner Cost Share Assistance Programs. And it's the one that the state of Missouri, the Department of Conservation, has available. We give $1.6 million annually to private landowners across the state on a first come, first served basis. And our funding cycle runs through our fiscal cycle, which is different than the federal government's. Ours is July 1st through June 30th. And we've got, everyone can apply, but also communities and municipalities are available to do this. And like I mentioned, we do this to try to advance the fish force and wildlife resources across the state. So we offer different cost share rates depending on different geographies. We've got the Missouri Department of Conservation has a tiered approach to conservation. So in conservation opportunity areas, quail restoration landscapes, they offer a higher cost share rate. And what cost share is unlike some of the programs we'll get into, if the practice costs you, in this instance, $100 per acre, the state would incur 75% cost share in those. Outside of our tiered approach, in the white spaces, it's 50% cost share. And then it's a maximum of this particular program of $6,000 per landowner per year on your geography. And we talked about that. So here is our focus area approach to community and private land conservation across the state. So you can see the majority of the state has some kind of tiered approach to it. And over, we're in Kansas City, we've got the Cass County quail restoration landscape. And then we also have conservation opportunity areas in the 4 counties that surround Kansas City. We really are starting a community and private lands approach. So we also have a community cost share programs that will address conservation concerns in the 4 counties in Missouri that are surrounding Kansas City. That would be Platte, Clay, Jackson, and Cass. So there's some opportunities there. So who do I contact? Well, Missouri is set up to where they have a private land conservationist, which is what I am, in all the counties in the state. So contact your local private land conservationist. And we're going to just go click through some of the contracts, some of what's available. So contracts are signed for each project regardless of acres. So we really, up to that $6,000 cap, you can have a $200 invasive species removal. That's fine. Our contracts for the Missouri Department of Conservation are typically between 5 to 10 years, depending on the project that you sign up for. And if you take the cost share from the state, you must maintain it. This isn't anything earth-shattering or groundbreaking. We don't want to put $6,000 into a land management practice of planting native warm season grasses only to have you tear it up and farm it in 2 years. That's a poor utilization. So 10% of the cost share projects are audited annually. Well, versus the paperwork that the federal government programs that we're getting ready to get into have, our cost share program is a 1-page document that you have to sign, and it's really a whole lot less involved than the system of some of these federal programs. However, the federal programs are where a lot more money is, to where I have a $6,000 cap. Some of these federal farm bill programs that we'll get into have multi-$1,000 contracts. So that's a little bit about what we've got as far as the practices involved in the Missouri Department of Conservation Landowner Cost Share Assistance Program. We've got native plantings, pollinator plantings, invasive species removal and control, tree plantings, prescribed burning, all of the land management things that we have here. So We're going to talk a little bit about, Tim mentioned the conservation stewardship program, the really big ones that we promote and they're pretty lucrative to landowners include, monarch plantings. Everyone's pretty familiar with the monarch butterfly and the loss of habitat that is existing down in Mexico where they overwinter. So CSP is a really lucrative program for monarch plantings, general pollinator plantings. Used to be bird houses. They don't do that too much anymore, but you can incorporate a lot of different land management practices in the CSP, including burning and spraying, but they're paying people for doing stewardship that have been doing this on their land, and your payments based on the practices that you do. The contracts are competitive across the state. That's not any different versus Kansas or Missouri. And NRCS is the Natural Resource Conservation Service, or the people who enroll and administer the conservation stewardship program. Typically a 5-year commitment. It changes based on your practices. And when I said this at the beginning, this isn't meant to try to flood everyone with tons of information. When you get the topic of, we really want you to talk about funding opportunities and cost share opportunities. I mean, we could be here for 2 hours going through the ins and outs of what this is and what this isn't. So I just tried to pick the highlights of each of these programs so we can have you guys can have a starting place to start the discussion with your local staff. The Environmental Quality Incentive Program, what we use, what this viewership probably would use the most would be timber stand improvement. So this is a practice of weeding your forest, permanent forest openings, things like that. Rotational grazing system, Tim did a good job of going through what that was. But you can also do pollinator plantings, burnings, exotic invasive species removal, and brush management through EQIP. It is as well funded and administered through the Natural Resource Conservation Service, 5 to 10 year contracts depending upon your practices, and it's competitive statewide. EQIP is always well funded, so we have a lot of funding opportunities for EQIP. You get you have certain program requirements, and for both CSP and EQIP, what you need to do is go in to your local NRCS office and sign up. So they call it a 1200 form, and talk to your local staff, your district conservationist, your soil conservationist about what practices and what you want to do on your farm. And they'll start getting you a conservation plan to help you implement your conservation goals. So Conservation Reserve Program, Tim talked a little bit about that. Over 40 practices to choose from, whether that's wetland development or a lot of vegetation practices like planting warm season grasses, even cool season grasses in there, trees. But they're typically, these contracts versus the NRCS practices, these are typically a little bit longer contracts, and it's a little bit different payment structure, to whereas the other is a cost share. These offer annual rental rates, and the rental rate is based on the soil on your particular farm. So it's administered through the Farm Service Agency, 30 million acres that are rolled nationwide. So it's wildly popular, especially in the northern Great Plains area. A lot of CRP ground up there. But the difference between the two the two NRCS and Farm Service Agency, the big difference is the length of contract, and this is a per year payment rate, payment that you get. So locally in Missouri, we have a soil and water, I misspelled soil, I'm sorry about that, soil and water conservation district cost share program. And what that is we've got DNR has 1/10 of 1% sales tax that's split between soil and water conservation and state parks. And with that money, the local soil water conservation district, and there's one of these in every county in the state, gets to have these cost share practices that include some pasture seeding, nutrient and pest management, cover crop, pond and well development, and terraces and waterways. So more structural practices there. These soil water conservation districts are located in the Natural Resource Conservation Service office, as well as your Farm Service office. There's usually 3 entities that are in the USDA buildings in the state of Missouri. That'd be the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the Soil Water Conservation Districts, and then the Farm Service Agency. But they've got lots of programs and practices that may fit into this viewership's goals and objectives. So it's a cost share versus a payment rate, much like the NRCS programs, and located in every county. So that's a real brief 15-minute discussion about what's available. We've got people here, me and Tim are around. This is my contact information. So I just encourage you to take this information as a starting place, and contact your local staff, and we'll help you help you try to develop a plan to help you meet your land management goals. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and we'll turn it over here.
That was wonderful. And you're good. The screen's down. You're
Okay.
set.
Thank you.
So I think what I'm hearing both of you say is that there's that every land is, oh wait, Tim and Andy, please come back on. It's our turn to answer questions from the audience. I'll give Tim a chance to, there we go, perfect. I think what I'm hearing both of you say is that it's not a one size fits all, that every landowner is an opportunity to explore the options and figure out what works best for them and what the ultimate goals are. But we do have some great questions in the chat, so I'm going to go ahead and start going through some of these. Steve asks, what environmentally friendly practices do you recommend for managing invasive species in pollinator habitat or other plantings that are cost shared through CSP and other programs?
Well, so I think whenever you're talking about invasive species, plant species, brush and stuff like that, there is some use of chemicals that we recommend, because our dollars are driven by conservation value. And so when we're removing something like invasive honeysuckle or hedge or locust trees or cedar trees, we want to make sure that that is a complete job and that those are removed off the landscape. And so a lot of those might require herbicides. Obviously, we try to keep it localized and minimize the impacts to the larger environment. But we view it research-wise that it's a lot better to have those things off the landscape than not. And so we do have short-term usage of herbicides in certain instances, especially with like honeysuckle or locust or hedge, which will send up root suckers after they're cut. So it doesn't do just to cut them down. You have to treat those stumps or they will come back. And so that's usually done through EQIP. We do not typically do that through CSP.
Got it.
On Kansas side.
That makes sense. And so, and when you say short term, my understanding, which is not as deep as yours and Andy's, is that you have to year over year keep going back to make sure that what you got rid of the first time is still gone, but also that some birds haven't delivered stuff from your neighbor's place, for example. So when you say short term, is that what
well, what I mean is, like, if you have, like, let's say you have an area that's infested, you've got, a large swath of understory of forest that's all honeysuckle, for instance.
Yeah.
You go in and remove that honeysuckle, and then it is, there's a stewardship aspect. And so the expectation is you have this big management practice that you've just undertaken, and it would behoove you to continue that stewardship to keep those invasives from coming back. But once you knock them back, it becomes much more manageable. as opposed to, a couple acres stand of these things that you don't want out there. And that's my take on it. I don't know if Andy has any input there, but that's kind of how we would look at that.
Yeah, it's the same over here in Missouri.
Okay. Are there any follow-on conservation cost share programs you'd recommend for continuing to maintain and enhance pollinator habitat as lands come out of initial programs such as CSP?
Definitely burning, if you can do it. If where you live allows you to do a controlled burn, I think that's a very good management practice. We have, and Andy touched on this a little bit. So all of our practices, it's a one-shot deal. If you go through EQIP, like you complete the practice, you get the cost share money, but then there's an expectation that you maintain that practice for the lifespan, what we call the practice lifespan. So for instance, monarch habitat is a 5-year lifespan on that practice. So you might install it in year 1, get paid for it in year 1, but you're expected to maintain that for 5 years. We would give a package. If you got a contract for monarch habitat, for instance, you would get the job sheet, practice standards and specs, and then follow-up practices and connected practices that we would recommend to maintain those plantings or that practice that you've installed.
I think
not all of those are cost shared. It's just an expectation that you do it.
Got it. I think my reading of the question is whether or not there's any subsequent funding options for lands that are coming out of initial programs such as CSP. And it sounds like no.
We have, for instance, like cover crop has a 5-year max that we'll pay for on one field. Okay. Monarch habitat, yeah, it's a one-shot deal. Once we pay for it, you maintain it, but we're not, so yeah, I guess there's not a lot of cost share, but there's plenty of help as far as, technical and resource wise, but yeah, we don't pay for follow-up stuff on the same land unit.
Excellent. So, which then made me question, what happens if you start participating in the program and then sell your land in year 2? Does that transfer to the new landowner, or what happens?
Well, if you sign up for NRCS, and I make it very clear whenever I work with a producer, you're signing a contract with the federal government and you're agreeing to carry out that contract for the lifespan. And so typically, there are exemptions, especially for CRP and that sort of thing, that are made, but it's not easy to get out of these contracts. And so if somebody doesn't have their contract complete and they sell their land, they can request cancellation of the contract. But if they have completed something like monarch habitat in year 1 and then they sell in year 2, we're still going to want that to be maintained. And so is I don't know that we have a lot of teeth on some of those things, but some of them we do, like the CRP is an annual payment, and that definitely is a lot more strict in that regard. But the expectation is that it's maintained for the practice lifespan, at least. Yeah, even if you transfer to a new landowner, which I know doesn't always happen. Like sometimes people get it and then they immediately, put up a barn or something, and that's just, we have to choose our battles. But typically we ask folks to maintain for, to agree that you're signing a contract with the federal government, you're agreeing to do the work and maintain it for that lifespan.
Right. And locally, for the CRP program, we always recommend that if you're in that program and you sell your land, as a condition of sale, they need to let the next landowner know that it's in CRP and secede to that contract, take that contract over. Because if they don't, you're liable for the penalties are stiff to get out of that CRP program, especially if it's been in for any amount of time. So the answer to your question is there are ways out. You just need to contact and get everyone involved at the whether it's the Farm Service Agency or NRCS from the beginning when you purchase a new property that is enrolled in some of these government programs.
Makes sense. It sounds like there's a disclosure element if for some reason you have to move after you started one of these programs. And it also, it's almost like it needs to be part of a title search when you're applying for loans, assuming somebody's being a loan. And or actually I think any purchase. Anyway, Connie asks, is there a minimum size land to qualify for these programs?
So in the instance of a high tunnel, no, I mean, it basically, the typical high tunnel is 30 by 72 feet. And if you've got a footprint in your yard, for instance, like I have some yards in Wyandotte County that have high tunnels, and it's like the whole yard. And so in that case, you know, that's a pretty lucrative deal for them. But in other cases, you know, a lot of our practices are paid by the acre. And so something like cover crop is like $50 an acre. That was our rate, around $50 an acre last year for cover crop. Well, if you have a quarter of an acre, that's not going to be a really good cost share for you, because it's, you know, I mean, you can enroll it, but the chances of it getting funded, because again, and I didn't talk on it as much as Andy talked about it, there's a competitive process. Our applications are ranked, and they're ranked based on the resource concerns that we're solving. So you put a half acre up against 500 acres of cover crop. Obviously, we're going to get more conservation value out of cover cropping 500 acres than a half acre garden plot or a quarter acre garden plot. And so there's some of that comes into play. So it just depends, I guess, is the answer, because there's certain practices that are geared for smaller footprints. And then there's some that are, you know, it's going to be more lucrative and more bang for your buck to have more land enrolled. Yeah,
For sure. I agree with Tim on that. Typically 10 acres, you know, before we start giving a lot of technical assistance at 10 acres is not always hard and fast, but that's about the smallest that the Missouri Department of Conservation wants to try to work with.
Makes sense. Have any attempts been made to measure the success of these great programs? For example, any estimates on the effects these programs have had on regional pollinator populations?
well, NRCS, USDA has Agriculture Research Service. We have a whole, you know, agency that is literally staffed by PhDs that do research on all of the practices we're talking about, and a lot of other, you know, things, anything to do with farming and agriculture and wildlife. And so there's you know, there's a whole research wing. A lot of our practices are driven by science and research, and but that's ongoing. And obviously extensions are involved in that, and universities are still involved in that. There's always research, and some of the practices, you know, we want to get more localized information. And so a lot of times extension gets involved in that. And K-State Extension, for instance, and up in Vermont, University of Vermont Extension was really involved in cover crop research, working with local farmers and trying to get before and after and nutrient levels and all kinds of stuff. And so the answer is yes, there's a lot of research to back up anything that we help pay for. Before and after, you know, it's harder to capture because you're trying to capture a lot, you know, larger time scale. And so that's yeah, it varies, but there's plenty of research to back up almost everything that we pay for.
Andy, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
No, he hit it. NRCS isn't going to do, or even Farm Service Agency isn't going to do anything that negatively impacts these pollinator populations, for sure. And they have, you know, their systems in place. They do heritage reviews. They're looking at trying to make a holistic approach towards conservation. As far as looking at, you know, planting a pollinator planting through CSP and then going through on a farm and then before and after, I don't know. I'm not familiar of any that level of attempts to see how successful it was. It's more of a big picture, 30,000 foot view kind of thing on that deal.
And then Steve.
Yeah, just one more point on that. One more point on that is that, NRCS has to adhere to NEPA regulations. And NEPA is National Environmental Protection Act. And that means that any government agency that undertakes anything has to follow those guidelines, that we're not doing harm with our practices, and that we're providing environmental and conservation benefit. And so all of our practices are geared with adherence to NEPA, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, et cetera, et cetera. So that's part of the deal as well.
Excellent. Sort of the first do no harm attitude.
Yep.
So Steve asked recommendations on drilling versus broadcast seeding of native grasses and wildflowers.
We have to send you an email, Steve.
Yeah.
It's too much. And I'm serious about that. Just give me your email. I'll send you some good recs, whatever I can do. It all depends too, but yeah, there's certainly some good advice that we can give, but that's something I would like to probably email out. Yeah.
Andy, I know you gave some advice to a friend of Deep Roots, Tim Rogers, when he was reconstructing his prairie. What technique did you and Tim land on for his space?
We drilled that. People, several of maybe in the audience went to that event at Tim Rogers over on the Kansas side. We took a fescue field, hay field is what it was, burned it down with herbicide, and then we drilled that into a highly diverse wildflower and some native grass mix. So that was a drilled seeding.
Excellent. And he, I believe, used 12 forbs and 8 grasses in his seed mix. Does that sound right?
Yeah,
Okay.
It wasn't as diverse as some, but it was for those who've seen it, it turned out very well.
And I think one of the things we picked up while we were there is it's likely that his land had never been plowed, because he had some forbs show up that were not in the original seed mix. And so that was
Awesome.
That was pretty exciting for him and for us to put those pieces together and enjoy it.
For sure.
Excellent. Well, I don't have any other questions in the chat. I would encourage our guests, if they have any more, to please go ahead and throw them in. Steve says, thank you for the excellent information. It was very helpful. And I enjoyed our conversation today. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm keeping an eye on chat. Meanwhile, I will go ahead and say to our audience, thank you for joining us, and please take a moment to fill out the session evaluation and let us know what you think. Our closing keynote begins at 11 o'clock Central Time. And while you wait, please visit our exhibitor chats and check out our generous sponsors. And if you want to listen to this session again or catch one that you missed, Planet Native 2022 is recording all sessions, and you'll have a chance to access those recordings for up to a year after this event. Well, Tim and Andy, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Thanks for your patience with the Zoom hiccups we had early on, but I think it all worked out. Thanks for your time.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you.